The National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, the NAIA, has just issued a policy that all but bans transgender athletes from competing in the opposite gender sport of what their biological sex is. And I believe this makes sense. This is effectively a shot fired calling out the NCAA's policy, which fails to do the same thing.
Today, the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics banned transgender women from competing in the women's category. They also banned transgender men from competing in the men's category. They are saying that they are including us, quote unquote, but we can only play in postseason activities, which means we cannot actually compete. You may not have heard of the NAIA, but it's the second largest governing body of sports in college in the United States, the largest being the NCAA, which I competed in. This ruling is devastating, and it sets a dangerous precedent for sports governing bodies in the United States and beyond. And this decision was not based on some new medical information or some new scientific studies or discoveries that have been made. No, it was based on massive political pressure, the socio-political war that is currently being waged against trans people and specifically transgender athletes. But these types of bans specifically against transgender women in women's category sports are not just going to impact transgender women. These bans impact all athletes in the women's category, because in order to exclude transgender women, you need to know which women are transgender. And this demands policing the entire women's category. At what point is a woman too fast, too strong, too good at her sport to then be accused of being transgender, accused of not being woman enough? This hurts all women, and especially those already deemed not woman enough by some system of oppression. Black women, brown women, trans women, intersex women, the list goes on. They say that transgender women are dominating women's sports, but most people cannot name a single trans woman who has ever won a national or international competition. And the reality is there's only a couple dozen of them in the history of sport. Trans women are not dominating women's sports. Cis people dominate sports. And if you're afraid of toxic cis men pretending to be a woman in order to win women's sports, you're still not afraid of trans women. You're afraid of toxic men. The inclusion of trans people does not threaten sports. The exclusion of us does. The NAIA's recent decision is disturbing and harmful.
All right, guys. So as predicted, when I first reported on this news of the NAIA banning trans women from women's sports, there would be a meltdown, okay? And lo and behold, that is what is happening as you have a non-binary ESPN writer running to CNN to boohoo, whine, and cry about the NAIA basically protecting women's sports, okay? Basically saying, look, we don't want unfair competition. We want biological women to compete amongst biological women. And again, in 2024, apparently that is something that is hateful and bigoted to simply say, hey, let's have fairness in sports, okay? So I want to react to this writer and the argument that he's going to make on CNN with no real pushback from Jake Tapper about why this policy is unfair or why this policy is wrong. And let's see if the argument that this person makes actually makes sense. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it.
Joining us now to discuss is journalist and author of Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debate, Katie Barnes. Katie, thank you for joining us. What do you make of the NAIA's new transgender participation policy?
Well, I think it is reflective of the times that we are in terms of, for the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen most policy updates when it comes to transgender athletes be reflective of restriction and in favor of more restrictive policy. And this seems to fall right in line with that.
There is a narrative that transgender female athletes have an advantage, that they always win, that the reason that men and women generally compete in separate gender categories is because it's not particularly competitive for men to compete against women. Do studies support that?
First and foremost, listen to the framing of this question. Again, this tells you how much of a joke CNN is. He's saying that it's a narrative. It is a narrative that when you have transgender women, okay, competing against biological women, that they have an advantage over biological women because of biology, right? That's not a narrative, right? That's not a narrative. That is a scientific fact. Okay, I mean, again, that is how ridiculous the media has become, guys. Where it's at the point now was like, yo, stating just basic biological facts that, hey, biological men have advantages over biological women in sports is narrative now, right? It's a narrative. It's a right-wing narrative. Again, the framing of that question is just so disingenuous. It's so dishonest. But again, it just shows you how much the left-wing liberal media is trying to make it seem like there's an actual debate around this, and it's not a real debate. at the end of the day, the NAIA is doing this for a reason. Okay, they're doing it because they know it's the right thing to do. The reason why you're seeing these bans happen in these states is because they know it's the right thing to do. Okay, there is no real debate about this. We know that generally speaking, it's not fair. So this is why it's happening. So let's listen. Let's listen to what the science says about this according to the woke left.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by support that. For my reporting and having really reported this out for many years, the reality is that from a scientific perspective, we know that there are differences in sexes, and we know that the differences do tend to lead to athletic performance differences as well. However, when we look at broad-based restriction at all levels of sport, it's very challenging to say that scientifically that is supported in all cases, meaning that something that might be appropriate for swimming does not necessarily apply to basketball when it comes to individual sports versus team sports, as well as level of competition. And so the idea, I think, that transgender women have an advantage in all sports at all times, regardless of any kind of medical transition, I don't think that the scientific literature supports that at this time.
Wow. Amazing attempt to try to thread the needle. So what this person is basically saying is that, well, the scientific literature does support the fact that, yes, there are biological differences between men and women. And yes, that gives men an advantage in sports. But hey, it's not all sports, right? It might not necessarily be the same amount of advantages when it comes to swimming or basketball or baseball or, some individual sport versus a team sport, right? Essentially what this person is trying to say is that, well, because, in some sport, okay, you may be able to basically minimize the differences. Therefore, any type of overarching ban is wrong, okay? This person is essentially arguing that we have to look at it on an individual basis. Therefore, there shouldn't be a ban. This ban isn't necessarily fair. That's essentially what they're getting at, okay? But again, what this person is failing to acknowledge is that a vast majority of the time, okay, you can look at any sport where you have men and women competing against each other, okay? Generally speaking, men are going to have an advantage, whether it be swimming, basketball, football, baseball. It doesn't matter what it is, okay? It doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter if it's an individual sport like weightlifting, okay, or a team sport like volleyball. Doesn't matter, okay? Generally speaking, if you are a male and you've been through puberty, then you're probably going to have an advantage. Now, does that mean that every trans athlete is going to dominate? No. They're just some biological males that are just born in a way that, hey, genetically speaking, they're just not that athletic, right? They're not that blessed athletically, okay? But when you talk about, on average, the average male versus the average female, there are going to be differences that are going to be tough for the average woman to overcome, okay? So, yeah, you're going to have instances where you're going to have some trans athletes, that are unfortunate enough to not be that genetically gifted when it comes to athletics. And then once you put them on, hormones or whatever to feminize them more, yeah, they're probably not going to be that good, right? You may have some female athletes that are genetically blessed that are going to beat them in some sport or going to be better than them. But again, generally speaking, the average male is going to perform better than the average woman. That's just the fact. So a blanket ban would make sense, okay? And if there's a situation where you have a trans athlete that wants to compete, then they need to compete amongst other trans athletes or compete based off their biological sex. That way you ensure that there will be fairness, and you don't have to look at every situation, okay, and examine a situation and say, oh, well, is this person athletic enough that it makes it unfair? Like you don't have to do that. You shouldn't have to do that, right? That just creates more chaos and confusion. A blanket ban makes sense, and then allowing trans athletes to compete amongst themselves, which should be a thing, right? That should be a thing if there's so much demand for trans athletes to play in sports. If the left wants to see it so bad, then they should have their own leagues. But see, notice how they don't support that. When the opportunity comes for them to actually support trans athletes playing in a fair way amongst other trans athletes, whether they were born male or female, they say, nah, we don't want to do that. We don't want to participate in that. In swimming, they tried to create a third category for trans swimmers, and they said no, none of them showed up. None of them showed up.
Would there be a way to come up with a rule that was more individual specific or sport specific that might not be? I mean, it sounds as though you're suggesting, and if I'm putting words in your wrong, I apologize. In your mouth, I apologize. It sounds like you're suggesting this policy is not necessarily fair, given how blanket it is. Is there a way to do something like this that would be more fair and more reflective of what is factually known about gender differences in different sports, et cetera?
You know, I don't know if it's right for me to say whether or not this particular policy is fair. I think that right now, where we are as a society is really grappling with what does fair and appropriate policy look like. And in general, most athletic organizations and many states across the country are embracing a blanket restriction. And I think there are a lot of people raising questions about whether or not that is fair and appropriate policy in all cases. And I do think that the jury is out on that, especially because when you look at the NAIA, there isn't necessarily a track record of transgender women competing in women's sports and dominating, right? It doesn't really seem like there is a particular problem, quote unquote, to be solved in this case. And so in general, I think the real question is going to be what policy can withstand being tested and be accepted when a transgender woman does compete and win. And it seems like right now the answer to that question is looking to remove any possibility of a transgender woman being able to participate and compete in women's sports at a variety of levels, and in this case, including collegiately.
Yeah, so again, it's just so funny how they know that when it comes to the science, they don't really have an argument. So now they've moved the goalposts to, well, it's not really a problem. There are not many trans athletes competing in the NCAA or the NAIA. So therefore, it just seems like these bans are just unfair because it's not a problem. When it's like, okay, well, we know that, you know, hey, it seems as if this is a lifestyle that a lot of kids are adopting. So we know that this is something that is going to become more common. You don't wait until the leagues start to become flooded with trans athletes before you determine whether or not, okay, should we do something about this? I mean, we have seen what happens when you allow trans athletes to compete against biological women. And again, we've had some controversial results. So seeing these things, you don't wait until you actually have the problem to deal with it. You go ahead and deal with it beforehand. That way you don't have to deal with the problem at all. It's less controversial that way, right? But to answer this person's question, or Jake Tapper's question as well too about, well, what policy is fair? Well, we already have a fair policy. Compete amongst your biological sex or compete amongst yourselves in a third category. Apparently, that's not what trans athletes want. So, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, the solution is there. And I'm pretty sure the woke powers that be are willing to create that solution. But it seems to me that there are people that don't want that solution, right? They want it their way or no way. And that's just not what's going to happen, right? It seems like the direction that the country's headed in, a lot of people, because behind closed doors, you know, probably 80-90% of the country agrees on this. Hey, everybody knows it's not fair. So I think that if transgender athletes want to play, okay, and they don't want to play based off their biological sex, then they have to accept the fact, okay, we're going to have to play amongst ourselves. We're going to have our own leagues. We're going to have our own competitions, and we're going to have to be happy with that. And everybody would be happy with that, right? Everybody would be happy with that. But again, that seems to be something that, you know, they don't want.
Do we have any idea what the numbers are of transgender athletes that are participating in college or university athletics, or even junior high or high school athletics. I mean, the amount of coverage and attention it gets is significant, and I don't know how many people we're even talking about necessarily.
We're talking about a very small number of people. I think that's really important to acknowledge, especially now that 24 states have passed restrictive policies, will have passed restrictive legislation, that affects K through 12 and often college sports. And so in about half the country, transgender girls and women don't have access to girls and women's sports at this time anyway. And in those states where you still have transgender girls and women eligible to participate in girls and women's sports, the numbers that are doing so are not necessarily known. It's not a data set that is readily available. But from the reporting that I've done over the years, the accepted number, so to speak, is very small and very few. Oftentimes in states where this has been debated and a number of athletes have come forward who are younger, who are talking about their experiences, we're talking about single digits in each state. And in the collegiate ranks, even though like the NCAA, for example, supports sports that have about 500,000 athletes across 24 sports at all three divisions, you're still looking at a very small number. Probably, I mean, we don't know it specifically, but I've been told from sources that it's well under 100. And so that are actively using the NCAA's policy. And in the NAIA, we don't really know how many known athletes there are, but it also is very small. And so we're not talking about thousands of athletes or tens of thousands of athletes. We're oftentimes talking about hundreds, maybe tens.
Katie Barnes, thanks so much. Really.
Yeah, I mean, that's irrelevant. Again, they want to try to talk about, well, how it's not that many of them, so why do you care? Well, again, it doesn't take that many of them to have what clearly and obviously is an unfair competition. Like, for example, Leah Thomas, basically dominating women's swimming. Like, again, I mean, come on now. If one biological woman is not able to compete fairly, if she loses a spot because of unfair competition, then that's more than enough to say, hey, we need to do something about this, that this is an issue. So, to me, you can see here the weakness of the argument from the left. Okay, they don't really have an argument. Okay, the argument really is that, well, our feelings are hurt, right? Our feelings are hurt, so therefore you should just allow it. That's it. I mean, that's just what it comes down to at this point. And it's like, no, that's not enough to win this debate. And that's the reason why you're seeing what you're seeing happening, is because people know that, hey, your feelings might be hurt, but we have to put fairness in women's sports above your feelings. That's just the reality of the situation. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.